Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today, Karthik. What a privilege and honor and a delight. I've been a big fan of your work, your important, very relevant, substantive work on all things what I would call responsible and good business, everything from corporate reporting to negotiations to bridging divides. And of course, we are going to talk about your book, The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World. Wow. I mean, that is such an important, substantive topic, and a topic that many business leaders I work with struggle with. How to engage? Should I? What if I don't? And in a world where often it's in a crisis situation. And your book sets out not only very compelling, moving stories, but even more importantly, a framework to help us navigate this world of outrage. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Now, if I look around and if I give myself the Lancefield view, it does feel there is more outrage, whether it's from some experiences on the high street, all the way through to when I listen and watch the news. They're horrific tales, and the reactions to them sometimes are not as rational or considered as we want. So, but beyond my own view of the world, as important as that is, how do you get a handle on outrage in terms of, how much more outrage do you think there is at the moment, and what indicators do you tend to use to give you that view?
That's a great question. And there's a reason I call it the age of outrage. It's managing in the age of outrage is not simply managing outrage. And there's something about this age that does make it distinctive. In my estimation, there are three factors that really play in. The first is this growing sense of fear of the future. Whether it's due to forces like AI and how that will change the nature of work, forces like climate change and how that will change coastlines and monsoon winds and things like that, or even forces like demographic shifts. By the year 2050, half of all the people under the age of 18 in the world will be in Africa. And so the future of human capital is in Africa. Yes. So all of these sorts of profound shifts mean that the world in the future will look very different from the world that we know today even. And, particularly in the context of things like AI and climate, people are worried that the future for their kids is not going to be as comfortable as the lives they've lived. Yeah. So that fear for the future is probably the first factor. There are a couple of other things that matter here, because if you simply have a fear for the future, but you have high trust in your institutions to navigate that, then you'd be generally okay. But we also live in an age where people have fairly low trust in their institutions, where people feel like they've somehow been dealt a raw deal. This is especially true with middle class and lower income workers in the Western world, who feel like the elites have sold them the wrong narrative on globalization, the wrong narrative on things like low-skilled immigration. Yes. So that contributes to this idea that somehow the rules of the game are rigged. There's, of course, a lot of evidence to suggest that the very rich pay a lower effective tax rate than middle income earners. And so put that together. And so now you've got a fear of the future and a sense of a raw deal, a sense that the rules of the game are broken. And these two factors, in my mind, sort of drive us into the third one, which is this notion of othering. Fewer people seem committed to this enlightenment project of, through the pursuit of knowledge and the advance of humanism, we will somehow figure out all of our answers to life's knotty questions. Instead, there's a sense that it's us versus them. And I've got to find my tribe and be part of my tribe. And we are somehow working against the other tribes out there. And so this othering is layering on to the fear of the future and the raw deal. Now, any one of these factors on their own, in the degree to which we're experiencing them today, would itself be an age of outrage. All three of these factors together, at the degree at which we're experiencing them today, certainly makes this a problem to reckon with.
Wow. I think that's a moment to have a deep breath. I've read your work and your book, but even when you hear it directly, it's still quite a shocking and moving, I guess, indictment of where we are. And if you had just a few moments with a typical CEO, they were their typical impatient self, as much as I like my CEO clients and friends, and they just heard what you just said. What words, if you only were allowed to give, I don't know, a couple of sentences on what type of person they need to be in that context, that outrage, what words and sentences would you use just in a few moments?
Yeah. So, two things come to mind. The first is no matter what you do, you won't be able to solve the whole problem. So, be deliberate about what you can do, be humble about what you can do. And the second is no matter what you do, you will be experienced as part of the problem. So, again, have a sense of perspective and humility about your role in all of this and let that inform your response.
Yeah, those are basic axioms you talk about in the book. Absolutely. So, if you are in the heat of it, you're a business leader, and there's a lot of noise around. It could be your whole organization. It could be a particular society you're operating in, community, whatever aspect. You're in the heat of it. In a nutshell, how do you choose how to play, where to play? The classic strategy questions.
Yeah.
Because I've seen some great practices, and
Yeah.
I've seen some awful ones. The awful ones where they say literally nothing, head in the sand, just hope it
Yeah.
will go away. Or they try and put themselves out as being the expert on a particular topic, and actually they soon just sound like idiots, to be frank.
Yeah.
So how do you
Yeah.
decide where to play?
So, strategy has to be, in some sense, preceded by an element of learning and listening, and active listening. And that requires a community of trusted advisors. These are particularly people who might be antagonists to your organization or antagonists to your mission. But having worked with them well in advance of any particular problem that you're trying to solve and determine whether and how to respond to it, you should have built a trust with them so that you have the capacity to pick up the phone and listen to them and see what they have to say about how you might navigate this moment. So that's really important because, of course, we all see the world through the lenses of our lived experiences, and that might not be sufficient in that moment. So making sure you have that community of trusted advisors, particularly those who are skeptical about what you're doing and
Yes.
skeptical about your organization, that's really important. And it precedes strategy. Then strategy is very much, in this context, what you've described it, which is the trade off of two forces: a force that we call capability asymmetries, which is a force that might push you in the direction of overreacting almost and saying, where do I have capabilities in this space and how might I be able to use those capabilities to mitigate a particular situation, if not address it. But of course, overreaction is a bad thing. And so there's another force, a balancing force there, which is the force that helps you identify how expectations shift. And that then sort of pushes you toward moderation. It pushes you perhaps even toward underreacting to a situation, because in most situations, you have no idea how expectations are going to unravel and shift over the course of the next few months. But you want to be, in the context of developing your strategy, balancing these two forces, balancing a force that really pushes you to identify and act on your capability asymmetries, and a force that pushes you to identify and respect how expectations will shift when you do act, and therefore how you might sort of overcommit in a situation and get yourself into even more trouble in a couple of months down the line. The third element of strategy is execution, right? All the best strategy in the world will get you nowhere. So a good part of the book is about factoring in that execution into the development of strategy, because what it is you should be doing in a situation is deeply dependent on how it is you'll be able to get it implemented. And oftentimes, the best strategy, you'll find that you're pulling the lever, but it's connected to nothing. And, then it'll come back to bite at some point. So you can't have this conversation on strategy without that precondition on active listening and that, in some sense, that implementation question as well.
I love your focus on the active listening, particularly proactively to people who you may feel uncomfortable listening to, the antagonist. I remember an old boss, now I come to think of it, who consistently used to reach out to a journalist that would always write pretty nasty things about the organization. And I think that sounds easy, as we talk about it now. That's hard to do when you know you're going into a conversation and it may be spun in a particular way, which I guess leads me on to a topic of, when you're thinking about that proactive outreach, who are, apart from every context is unique and specific, I know, but who would be the particular actors that you would reach out to, in terms of categories of organizations? You think, you know what, as you're trying to get a handle on some of these big shifts and moods and dynamics, these are the types of organizations or individuals you should be reaching out to. Who would be on
Yeah.
your list?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly from the perspective of commercial business, you'd want to be thinking about your employees, and you'd want to be thinking about your customers, and you'd want to be thinking about your supply chain, and you'd want to be thinking about your investor base, and you'd want to think about your regulators at a very minimum. And beyond that, of course, you'll also look at things like local communities and so forth and say, okay, how might they be impacted? If you're a government agency, likewise, you will have a different set of constituencies that you'll want to reach out to. But as you're thinking about these constituencies, what's important is also factoring in who are the really catalytic factors, or who are the really catalytic individuals in these communities.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, there are one or two organizations or one or two individuals that can really have a pivotal impact in shaping the narrative one way or the other. So in the book, we talk, for instance, about a case study involving the Commissioner of Police of the City of London, of London Metropolitan, that is to say, not the small city. And the Commissioner, is dealing with protests around issues around, COVID and the restrictions thereof, issues around Black Lives Matter, and which are very serious, and as well as issues around this data that the Metropolitan Police's use of stop and search tends to be highly discriminatory, particularly amongst young Black Londoners. So the data seem to suggest that if you're a young Black Londoner and if you're male, then you're in some instances as much as 10, even 16 times more likely to be stopped than if you were, say, a white Londoner. So now this is some really disturbing data, and the Commissioner of Police is in the case study is dealing with a headline in the Guardian newspaper, which is reporting on this. And of course, your phone is ringing nonstop from a lot of people that want you to weigh in on this, including your boss, the Mayor of London, the Home Secretary of the country, other newspaper editors, community activists, etc. But one really catalytic stakeholder here is the head of the Met Black Police Officers Association, right? As the Commissioner of London Metropolitan Police, it's really important for you to figure out what the head of the Met Black Police Officers Association is thinking, and to have that voice factor into your conversation. Because if you lose the Black police officers in that moment, you've lost the war. There's nothing there to fight for. So that is what we would call an example of a catalytic stakeholder in this process. So, of course, there's the standard menu of stakeholders you go through.
No, I love that catalytic.
But identify the catalytic ones.
And how do you create this space and, I guess, the wisdom to focus on those catalytic actors at a time when, as you say, social media is exploding, your inbox is full, you work with business leaders all the time, you bring them together, a topic we'll come back to. From the best you've worked with or researched, what practices do they use to actually create the headspace to really say, you know what, I've really got to reach out to, rather than, we're going to create a massive task force, we're going to do lots and lots of things, and actually just do a sort of spray sort of strategy.
Yeah. And this connects to the theme of resilience that we talk about in the book, right? And goes back to what I said earlier about managing in the age of outrage is quite different from managing outrage. Managing outrage is sort of like crisis management. You can put some pros from your PR team or an external agency on it, and it's firefighting. Managing in the age of outrage would be effectively, if you use that strategy, if you use that approach, you'd be firefighting all the time. And then where's the time to do the thinking? Where's the time to do the fire prevention? Where's the time to do the economic growth and all the other stuff that you've got to do, right? So that approach to managing in the age of outrage simply won't work.
Mm.
And so resilience becomes a very central theme of managing in the age of outrage. It's an important theme for you individually as a manager, but also for your organization. Because what you need to do is ensure that your organization and you are continually renewing yourselves in that sense. What does that entail? At the very basic level, it entails giving the organization the capacity to make the decisions that it can make without having them have come to you in every situation. You don't need to be, as the leader, the firefighter in every situation. If you've built an organization that has the capacity to take intelligent risks and make important decisions when these kind of crises hit, but also has the capacity to and the trust to understand that they will be supported if they make the wrong decision, right?
Yes.
So you want to be able to delegate information to the level of the organization which is most competent to make that decision. They need to feel trusted to make that decision and not be retaliated against, but they also need to be trained up to have that competence that you're imagining of them. So
Mm.
all of those things are part of building that resilience at the organizational level. But then there's also resilience at the individual level. And again, it goes back to that second axiom that I raised earlier, where you're going to be part of the problem, whether you like it or not. You'd love to see yourself as a leader in this situation, as the sort of, knight in shining armor that shows up and solves everything. But you're not. I mean, these problems are way bigger than any one individual or any one organization. If you think about the three factors we talked about,
Yes.
right? So having that sense of perspective and say, I am going to be part of the problem. And so there will be limits, and I have to have the capacity to shut off. I have to have the capacity to say, look, this is the sort of place where I don't engage, or this is the sort of place where even if I am being personally attacked or called to respond, it's best if I stay silent. And in the book we talk about the value of stoicism in this moment.
Yes. Yes.
And Stoics get a bad reputation as being sort of emotionless and so forth. But I think the element of stoicism that's so valuable here is this, what is called dialectical sophistication. The idea that you can be careful about your words, you can be selective about your words, and that itself will help you navigate these kinds of challenges as an individual.
It's a very skillful act, isn't it, what you're describing? Because it requires control, large amounts of discipline, a lot of emotional intelligence, and then also being conscious of the choices you have. I know a number of leaders who represent, at least visibly, a particular group, ethnic group, religious group, and many people effectively say to them, because you're in our group, you should do X, Y, and Z. And staying silent doesn't really work because people, well, are you not a member of our group? At the same time, they are the leader of the business. So they have a responsibility to the business. Treading that line where you can call out perhaps an element of your own feelings, whilst then also still being true to the organizational purpose, which will have a whole series of constituents, is a very, very skillful act. And I'm just curious, you'll have seen this up front and personal. Any reflections on that balancing act, or that, I guess, that integration of different versions of yourself?
Yeah. So once again, I'll underscore, don't try to please all of the people all of the time. It'll never work, and you will quickly deplete yourself. So you should have the confidence as an individual. And if you don't work on that, work with a coach to build that so that you're not in a situation that you're trying to please all of the people all of the time. It just doesn't work. There's so much diversity in the world. The second aspect of this is I found that people give you a lot of slack if they experience you as authentic, right? So they will give you the ability to have a different view, notwithstanding, say, what is expected of you because of your race or your gender or your sexuality or some other sort of, defining characteristic. They will give you that slack to be different if they experience that as authentic. Now, that means, of course, that you are authentic about it, And it also means that you have sufficiently communicated that authenticity to others. It's both of those things, right?
Yes,
Because
yes.
sometimes you might well be authentic about it, and you've just failed to communicate why that is so important to you and why that might be different from what people expect. And sometimes, of course, it may be just pure PR on your part where you're trying to communicate something as authenticity, but people are smart; they see
Yeah,
through it,
I can
right?
spot it a mile off.
So in that sense, people give you credit if they experience you as authentic, and that's
Mm.
something that, as a leader, you want to be working on, so that people are able to understand where it is you come from on this issue. The final thing is that where organizations seem to really get into trouble is when they use one crisis to score a point, when they use one crisis to
Mm.
score, in some sense, a PR point and say, oh, look at how amazing we are, etc. Because, of course, that won't be the last crisis. I mean, the age of outrage means that they're going to keep coming at you. And then your response in that previous crisis is going to be the benchmark for what's expected of you in the next one. And it's when people experience that dissonance that they then start reading hypocrisy into it, and that comes back to bite. So being modest about what it is you can accomplish, that doesn't mean not. So it doesn't mean underperforming, but it
Mm.
means being realistic about what you can deliver, with the view that this isn't the last crisis. That's why I mentioned resilience earlier, and say, I have to be able to live to fight another day, and I don't know how this is going to evolve. So this is what I can do today, and tomorrow when something comes along, I know I can do at least this, right? That's how
Yes,
you calibrate.
yes. And that's one of the many great aspects of your work, where you emphasize that this is both a mindset and a capability throughout organizations. It's not reserved just for a SWAT team or a C-suite. And hence, people should be and will be watching your moves in order to not only get a signal as to where they should focus or what to ignore, but also because they should be taking decisions themselves. If you're running a team in a business unit, you may have your own sense of outrage in your local community, in your customer base. You have to make the decisions you've just been talking. You need that cascade throughout the organization. So it really matters. Otherwise, you're always relying from somebody on the top effectively barking out orders and you duly complying, which is no way to run a business, although many do. I want to come back to the theme of conversation and bringing people together, because I know from your work, and I know people who've been party to your work, you don't just talk about this or research it and write about it. You actively bring groups of people together to have meaningful conversations on topics and situations that are incredibly delicate. I don't particularly want to name an individual one, but read the book, read your work. They are the harsh reality of, wars, conflict, religious divides, and so on. What does it take? And even more importantly, what do you do to create meaningful, thoughtful, considered dialogue in the hardest, most, where there's so much outrage outside the room, inside the room? What do you do? What are your tips that other people could learn from?
Yeah. The first is really not to be surprised by the fact that you're going to be put in these situations, and to start preparing for it even when times are good, right? Let
Mm.
not be the first time you think about it when the crisis hits, because that's
Yes,
part of
yes.
the age of outrage. The second is then to use that time when you're not dealing with an immediate crisis, when times are relatively good, to really build the relationships that you will need when times are tough. And so, for instance, for the last 7 years, I served as the director of the Master Public Policy program here at Oxford. We brought together about 1,000 public leaders from
Yes, brilliant.
150 different countries, the US and Russia and China and Ukraine and Pakistan and India and Israel and Palestine. And so, every division and every source of conflict point in the world was represented in some way. But on the very first day of the program, when we brought them all in, people genuinely were in a place of a good space. They were in a place where they wanted to listen and learn and engage. So, what did I do in that first week? I actually took them out rowing. I said, well, here at Oxford, a big part of the sort of the culture and the tradition is shaped around the river, and in particular
Mm.
around rowing. Now, not many of them could swim, so we wouldn't actually put them on the river. But what we do is put them in what is called the tank, which is sort of like a simulated river, and it's sort of like a swimming pool, but set up like a rowing boat. And you put them in that boat and you get them to row together. You're trying to do two things there. Number one, you just want people to sweat together.
Yes.
When people sweat together, there's a sense of vulnerability when sort of, pardon my French, when the Dio breaks down and, you're
Yeah.
just sort of vulnerable with everybody. And then you're at your natural human state. And so, on the first day of the program, everybody showed up in their suit and tie and their Sunday best and so forth. And then on the second day, you said, actually, I want you to leave all that at home and I want you to come in your gym shorts because we're going to go to the university tank and we're all going to sweat together. So that's just sort of part of why you put them in the rowing boat. The other reason you put them in the rowing boat, and rowing was uniquely well suited for this, is you're putting people in groups of 8 and you're making them compete with each other, the other teams, that is to say. And what they have to quickly realize is that they can't be the fastest person in their boat of 8. They've got to learn to pace themselves with the 7 other people in that boat who they've only just met. They don't even know each other.
And you
right?
mix up the groups?
Yes, they're completely randomized across, right? So you can have, someone from China and Israel and the US and Ukraine and Russia all in the same group. And they have to suddenly get to know each other, get along with each other, and learn to pace themselves with everybody else in that boat. Otherwise, the boat just goes around in circles. So that's a metaphor for the kind of things that you want them to be able to do in the long run. But the reason you're doing this in the first week is because they then get to experience A, that vulnerability with each other, but B, some shared sense of victory, a small victory, right?
Yes,
Winning some silly mock Olympics that we run in a university tank race is, but they have experienced as a group that will be prone to sort of more substantive and profound conflicts. They have experienced some sense of victory with each other. That's really important because there's that shared memory of the victory that they can then call on. There's the shared memory of the vulnerability that they can then call on when the hard time hits, right? So it's taking the time when times are good to help people build sort of a shared experience. That was one of the big sort of ahas that we delivered on as we were trying to build this unlikely coalition across these 150 countries.
I love that. That's brilliant. I can just picture it. So go on the flip side, when you have moments though, for all of that investment where in the classroom, in the groups, there is a heated moment. I can't imagine you'd go with a few days without some form of heated moment. What were your, tactics and strategies to, well, I guess I'm leading the witness now, bring down the temperature and I guess explore a different path? What did you practically do? Because it's one thing to talk about it, but when you're in the thick of it, when it's real, when you've got real human beings getting very, red in the face, maybe shouting, using strong language and so on. I mean, it's hard. It is hard. Yeah. So what do you do?
Yeah. So, and you use the right phrase here, which is turning down the temperature, right? And that's what you've got to do, because if people are in this elevated emotional state of disagreement and aggression, they will say things they don't mean and they will dig themselves deeper. And then it just becomes harder and harder to sort of undo that. So how do you turn down the temperature? Well, it turns out that the science of aggression tells us a lot on how we can do this. And so that's why I spend a whole chapter in the book on this, not with the view of sort of hoping my readers will become experts on aggression science, but really to say, okay, how do we take from that science some practical tips on sort of turning down the temperature, on de-escalation? Right? That's a sort of, as you say, it's almost a necessary condition to make this happen. And again, you can't be surprised. No matter all the best laid plans you have, you're going to deal with blowouts, right? And we've done this not just in the classroom setting, we've done this in sort of very sort of sensitive real world settings involving government agencies and companies and so forth. And the first and most important thing is to set yourself the right ambient conditions. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes you find that people are having these conversations in the worst possible settings. They're doing it when the sun is shining on their face in a crowded room while they're standing up and drinking coffee. Oh my God. No, all of those things, right? So let's go sit down. Let's make sure we're in a cool room. Let's make sure we've had something, relaxing to drink and eat, maybe some chocolate cake. These are simple things about the biology of, our brains
Mm.
that have a profound impact on our ability to engage. Just down the street from where my office is in Oxford, there's this fine bakery. And when I was leading the program, they would see me there from time to time with some outraged stakeholder, treating them to chocolate cake because that was the first thing. First thing you do, we have chocolate cake, then we talk.
Okay.
So that's the ambience, right? And that's sort of the
Yes.
first layer of de escalation in the science of aggression. The second thing is to appreciate that we might be triggered to aggression in any context by some sort of emotive response, right? Because the brain tends to make a decision instinctively and then reason afterward.
Yes.
So, again, giving people a chance and time to step away from that emotive response and say, we say often sleep on it, right? To say, okay, we've had a chance to appreciate that people are animated about the situation. Let's set a time for tomorrow to talk about it.
Yes.
Let's not
Yes.
talk about it today, right? So that it's not the emotive response and it is, say, the more cognitive response that then kicks in. But then the third thing is that cognitive response itself is a product of lived experiences, a product of what the science of aggression literature calls scripts.
Mm.
And those scripts are, in fact, shaped in your childhood. They are shaped by your education, by your experience. And quite frankly, by the time you get to 25, 30 years of age, those scripts are more or less baked in, right? So the
Mm.
idea that you'll be able to sit down with someone, even if it's on the next day in a very comfortable room after chocolate cake, and somehow change their scripts from 40 years of lived experience, that's crazy. That's foolhardy, right? So then there needs to be some authentic listening and saying, okay, well, people here need to be heard.
Yes.
And
Yes.
oftentimes, you're, as the manager, not the right person to lead that conversation. So you should have the confidence and the self awareness to find a more neutral interlocutor to
Yes.
lead that conversation,
Yes.
right? So those would be some sort of simple tips to
That's
getting things
great.
done
Love that.
in, yeah.
Love that. That's very real. I can just imagine being in either that patisserie, the cake shop, or the or your classroom. Let's delve into you a little bit more. So you talk, but beyond the cake, when you feel personally strong sense of outrage, what do you personally do? From all the things you described, or perhaps something new, what do you do? Give us a sense of the real you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, someone gave me a great metaphor for this. They said, just as you don't want a surgeon to go from one operating theater to the next without having washed their hands, you don't want a manager going from one situation to the next without having metaphorically sort of, found themselves at peace with whatever it is they're dealing with, maybe in their private life or in that previous
Yes, yes,
situation, etc. So again, having the self-awareness and the confidence to know that you're in no state to make a difference. You're probably in a state where, let alone doing good, you'll probably do some harm, right? And therefore step away. So there are days when if you feel like I can't be on, then you're best working from home, right? And just be confident and comfortable and have the authenticity to communicate that with your team. In fact, they will appreciate the sense of reality and the sense of vulnerability that communicates. So you don't have to be on all the time. You can't be on all the time. So from time to time, you don't come in, and that's okay. I mean, thankfully, after COVID, that has all been normalized. So if you work from home one day, I mean, you can still send emails and do Excel and
yes,
things like
yes,
that. You can do the stuff that doesn't require the real intense emotional engagement. So that would be one way in which you address it. Another sort of wonderful sort of quote that I've heard, which has been so meaningful to my life, I'm told that this is attributed to Marilyn Monroe. And she says, never underestimate the value in life of being able to come back home to your front door and know that there is someone on the other side who awaits your return. right?
Beautiful.
And whether that's a
Beautiful.
dog, a cat, a child, a parent, or a spouse or partner,
Yeah.
that's really important, right? Again, having those spaces to be off. That's been really important in my life.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. And as we draw to a close, I'm going to continue on the more perhaps philosophical note. What impact are you looking to have on the world around you in doing your work?
Um, Look, I'll be very honest. I wrote this book first for me, right? I found myself in this moment where I was doing this job where I felt like, oh my God, I have no idea how to bring this community together, 1,000 leaders from 150 countries, and leave them better for it. And so I said, one of the things, the inside secret that academics do when they don't know how to do something is they teach a course on it. So I said, I'm going to teach a course on this because then I can get my friends who are CEOs and COOs in business and government and not for profit sectors to come and share with us what they do. And they can be guests in my class and we can collectively figure out what the answer is. So that's really how I got started on this journey. And what I said was in the first year of the class, I had 8 CEO friends come to the class over the course of 8 weeks and share with us their most difficult dilemma in this context of the age of outrage without telling us what they did. So the class would then discuss in case method style what could be done, but also their most compelling piece of reading that helped them navigate that time.
Mm.
Some of this was, say, scientific reading. Some of it was Shakespeare. Some of it was somewhere in between, right? But it was that kind of eclectic mix that really mattered in, putting some structure to this. And then as we got to a place where I taught this course 5 or 6 times, I said, well, maybe there's something here that can be useful to others that are dealing with this. And so I wrote an essay on it and sent it to my editor at the Harvard Business Review. And they said, well, we'll publish it, but we think it's too short. So we think you need to write this out into a book. And that's where the story of this, the genesis of this book came from. So look, what I really hope is that in this world that we're living in, which has sometimes for very right reasons, a great deal of anguish and uncertainty about, everything that has come and will come, that we are somehow able to, as leaders, as managers, as protagonists in these situations, leave things better than we found it. Right? To me, that's been the simplest, most
Yes.
effective
Yes.
definition of leadership. And I hope that this work, this agenda, will do a little to that end.
Well, I believe, from my own perspective, I believe it does. Gosh, what a stimulating, moving conversation. I love how you move from big picture topics all the way down into the personal, I guess, habits we can learn in real life situations. And you do it in such a personal and engaging way. And you share a bit of yourself, which is refreshing too. Karthik, thank you ever so much. Where can people find out more about your work beyond buying the book, of course? Where can they find you online if they're interested in your work and your courses and programs?
So my website is karthikramanna.com. And so it's KARTHIKRAMANNA.com. And, that's usually updated with all of the latest stuff that I'm on. Some of the stuff is fairly technical and some of it is more managerial. And I hope to engage with all of you in some way. And I hope to be able to see many of your listeners at some point, meet them in person at some point.
Wonderful.
Thank you for having me, David.
No, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Karthik. Well, that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel, the podcast. And Karthik, thank you ever so much again.